Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just waiting for the attendee list to get up before we start. I can see lots of people joining in. I'll just give it a minute or so to make sure everybody's managed to log in okay. Right, I think that's probably everybody, but people will still be able to join us. Oh, a couple more people coming in there. Right, I'll kick off now. So welcome everybody to the first in our How's Percival Housing Snapshot webinar series. Got some lovely headshots here of our social housing team at How's Percival. So today for this webinar, you've got myself and Jonathan Parker, JP. I'm Estelle Corner, head of the social housing team at How's Percival, and JP is a senior associate in the team. A couple of things to cover before we kick off. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the webinar. So if you would like to ask anything, please use the Q&A function on the screen. Only myself and JP will see those questions. If you've got any technical difficulties at any stage during the webinar, please let us know using the chat function and we'll try and help. So today's first webinar, we're going to be talking about KIDs, otherwise known as Homes England's key information documents for shared ownership. I've had a look at the attendee list and I'm safely assuming that you all have an excellent knowledge of shared ownership already. So I'm going to be throwing around lots of acronyms. But if we say anything you don't understand, please don't feel scared to send us a comment and we'll explain it in the chat. The aim of this session is to give you a need-to-know understanding from an RP, from registered providers' perspective, of the new key information documents. Now, we've only got 30 minutes, so we won't have time to go into all of the details. But first of all, I'm going to give you some background about what KIDs is all about. JP will give you an overview of the various types of key information documents and the process, and we'll drill down into some more detail on some of the individual documents and how to complete them, and then Q&A at the end. Now, I've got a bit of a September kids back to school cold going on, so please excuse me if I start croaking. Hopefully my voice is going to hold out to the end of this. So KIDs, what's it all about? Homes England's own words, these, the KIDs, are provided to help shared owners understand what they're purchasing. And you can't disagree with that as a principle. Shared ownership is complicated and buyers need to go into it with their eyes wide open. It seems to me that this is at least in part a reaction to some of the bad press that shared ownership has received in recent years. Now, I've got some headlines I found here that I've got up on the slide. A lot of the criticism focuses on costs and hidden costs in particular. And as we will see, costs are very much at the forefront of the new key information documents. I'm going to take a slight detour here, but it is still relevant, and look at a very recent headline from last week. Shared ownership ruled misleading. It doesn't solve any of the problems it's supposed to. Now, this relates to a ruling last week from the Advertising Standards Authority, all to do with a challenge brought by Shared Ownership Resources against what was a National Housing Federation promotional campaign for shared ownership. You might have seen this campaign last year, early part of last year, on the sharedownership.net website. Some of you may also be familiar with Shared Ownership Resources, who were described as a campaigning platform in the ruling. So I put on the slide some of the quotes from this advertising campaign website. So the first challenge by Shared Ownership Resources was whether the claims part rent, part buy, and it's yours were misleading because they exaggerated the level of ownership in shared ownership. Their second challenge was around the claim you can usually staircase all the way up to 100%. They said that was potentially misleading because staircasing is uncommon. And their third challenge was saying that the advertising website misleadingly omitted information relating to the costs of lease extensions. The ASA upheld the first and the third challenges, so the one about ownership and the one about costs. On the first point, the ASA focused very much on assured short-hold tenancy status of shared ownership. And on the second point, it really was all about hidden costs. I mean, I think the NHF campaign could perhaps have been more tightly worded. I winced when I saw that it's an investment phrase on the website. But there's also a lot to disagree with in the ASA ruling. But ultimately, we come back to what I was saying earlier, that it is all about making sure that potential shared ownership buyers fully understand what they are buying. And that brings us back to the key information documents. So we've known these were coming for a while because we always knew they were part of new model shared ownership. The basic premise is that these new documents replace the former Appendix 3 in the shared ownership leases, and that isn't a bad thing because that Appendix 3 wasn't the best, it wasn't particularly helpfully worded. So these new information documents are a mix of standard explanatory wording about shared ownership and the terms of the shared ownership lease, so much like Appendix 3 in that way, but with a new element of property and provider specific costs and fees. So we knew what was coming for new model shared ownership and probably all parked it as something to deal with in the future. But then Homes England announced earlier this year that kids had to be used on existing shared ownership. So shared ownership funded under the Shared Ownership and Affordable Housing Programme 2016 to 2021 from September 2022. So just from a couple of weeks ago. The most important thing to remember about these key information documents is that they are a grant funding condition. Providers must complete the documents and provide them to the customer no later than at reservation stage. Also worth noting that if you do resales, the kids also apply to resales. And there's quite a lot of confusion and debate about how they're going to work on resales. Hopefully there will be some more guidance from Homes England, but for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to concentrate on how the kids apply to first tranche sales. There are different packs of key information documents depending on the circumstances of your transaction, and I'll pass over to JP now, who's going to tell you a bit more about those packs.
Right, thank you, Estelle. So we'll start off with a quick quiz question. The question being, how many different key information documents are there? There will be three options. Option A is 3, B 27, and C 50. And hopefully a little poll will pop up on screen in front of you for you to submit your answer. I'll just give you a few seconds to do so. So we've got votes coming in. And if we close the poll there, now I've got the results on my screen. So there's a bit of a mix actually between 3 and 27. But
that's really interesting that no one went for 50.
Yeah, but the answer, in fact, is there are 27 key information documents currently published in the Capital Funding Guide. There we go. So how do we get to 27? Well, each pack of kids comprises 3 separate documents. The first is key information about the shared ownership home. The second is a summary of the costs of the shared ownership home. And the third is the key information about shared ownership itself as a product, and we'll look at how these differ shortly. There are also different versions of each of these three documents depending on the funding programme and the type of shared ownership. For shared ownership funded under the 2016-2021 programme, you have a pack for standard shared ownership, a pack for DPA leases with staircasing cap, a pack for DPA leases with mandatory buyback, and a pack for OPSO, older persons shared ownership. For the new model of shared ownership funded under the 21-26 programme, you have the same list again, plus a pack for hold, home ownership for people with long-term disabilities. So that's 9 packs, each with 3 documents, so 27 different key information documents in total. And you must make sure that you are choosing the right documents for each home. So to do so, you need to know the funding programme as a starter, and then the specific type of shared ownership. So how will the introduction of the key information documents impact on the sales process for registered providers? Well, under the previous system, with the key information document at Appendix 3 of the shared ownership lease itself, this was something for your lawyers to deal with when drafting the leases. But now the process is very much being front-loaded and the responsibility is passed very much to registered providers. It may be something which RP solicitors advise them on as part of a site setup, but ultimately the responsibility is on the RP to complete and provide the individual document to buyers. We've outlined the process on the slide. Starting with pre-marketing, you need to be gathering all the costs and fees information that you need for the key information documents, including market values, estate charges, and your service charges, so that you are ready to provide KID 1, as we'll call it. So that's the key information about the home document when you market each property. Prior to reservation, you need to provide KID 2, that's the summary of costs, and KID 3, key information about shared ownership, to the prospective buyer, and according to the Capital Funding Guide, you must explain these documents to the buyer, who should be given the opportunity to ask questions before reserving the home. You will want to have a think about how you evidence that you've done this. Perhaps some additional wording in the reservation forms would suffice. And finally, you must send a set of the completed KIDs to the buyer's solicitors with the sales memo and obtain specific confirmation from the buyer's solicitors that the KIDs have indeed been provided to them. Again, you will need to think about how you will ensure this is done, particularly if you use third-party selling agents. And I'll just pass back to Estelle now, who will be covering our next part of the presentation.
Thank you for that, JP. I've put up a summary on the screen of the 3 key information documents. I'm going to talk about the documents for standard shared ownership under the 2016 to 2021 funding programme. But as JP explained, there are different versions of the documents which vary to reflect the differences in the types of shared ownership. KID 1 is information about the home. This is intended to accompany your property listings, and you need to do this on a plot-by-plot basis. The type of information you need to add to this form includes the property address and type, market value, share purchase price and rent examples based on different percentage shares, so you give the buyer kind of a picture depending how much they buy. Details of the monthly payments that go into the landlord, so that be including service charge, estate charge if applicable, buildings insurance, management fee, reserve fund if applicable. Details of your reservation fee, any specific eligibility criteria that apply to the lease term, which say 125 years, 990, depending which model of shared ownership, and interestingly, your pets policy. KID 2, the summary of costs, is provided to specific buyers once they've been approved. So once they've been through the Help to Buy registration process and passed financial assessment, it must be given to them before they reserve. Again, this is very detailed to the buyer and to the property. So in this form, you're covering the market value, the share price that this buyer has been offered, deposit, reservation fee again, monthly payments again, but this time with more detail about what the service charge, estate charge, etc. covers. So you're going to need to know that detail at this point. Your rent review date, your additional percentage rent increase over RPI, i.e. no more than 0.5%. Your valuation and administration fees for staircasing, your resale fees, and at the end there is a final section which very broadly covers other potential costs from the landlord. So the idea of this is that it covers costs now and in the future, such as permission and consent fees, so for kind of mortgage, remortgage approvals, for alterations, that kind of thing. It's suggested in the document you could link to a full fees list on your website if that's what you have already. You could send a separate costs document, or there's space to input the fees into the KID. There is a note at the front of the key information document that does say that costs will typically increase annually. So don't worry that if you put a fee in here, you're going to be stuck with that for 990 years. KID 3 is the key information about shared ownership, and this is much more like the old Appendix 3 and explains the key terms of the shared ownership lease in plain English. And I have to say that actually this is quite well drafted compared to the old Appendix 3, and some bits of it are very good. The explanation of the resale process is much clearer than I've seen before. A lot is made about lease extensions in this form. Again, I would say this is going to be a reaction to the media criticism about lease extensions and shared ownership. And if you will need to have a lease extension policy if you don't have one already for the buyer to refer to. Obviously, if you're using these documents on a first tranche sale and you're already ahead of the game and granting 990-year leases, then the lease extension wording is going to be irrelevant and will seem quite out of place potentially to buyers. And this could be where the whole idea of explaining the documents to your customers could prove to be very important. But obviously, the lease extension wording is still going to be relevant if you're using this form on resales where you've got leases that were for 99 or 125 years originally. So that's a bit of a summary of what is in each of the documents. There are instructions given by Homes England on how to complete these documents. So they may be branded, you can put your Housing Association RP brand all over them, but you may not alter the content nor the order of the information. The one exception to that is KID 3, and there you can supplement with additional services you offer or more detail on your individual processes. You're told to follow the instructions in yellow in KID 1 and 2, and I've put a little bit of an extract of one on the slide there so you can see the sort of thing. And you add in specific information as directed and delete things that aren't applicable. You can provide the kids the documents electronically or in hard copy, but a bit of a note of warning if you are providing printed versions, because Homes England say you also have to then provide printed versions of the information that is on the hyperlinks. And there are a lot of hyperlinks in these documents. There are links to the RPI dataset, there are links to government websites on SDLT, there are links to advice pages on home insurance, there are links to advice pages on service charge. So you would end up having to provide an enormous pack of documents if you went down that route. The other thing to bear in mind that Homes England say is that you must ensure that accessible versions of these key information documents are available for customers who require them. So that has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of key information documents, say a brief summary of the key aspects of it. To sum up, I think there are some really good intentions behind the KID. Some of these explanations in the documents are much clearer than before. And as I said, shared ownership is complicated. I mean, I would rather see a lease that was written in plain English, but that's not going to happen anytime soon with the shared ownership lease. So I think in some ways, clear explanations are the next best thing. But I think the big downside is that this is clearly going to create a lot of extra work and process for RPs. And smaller RPs in particular may struggle with this because they don't have the scale to necessarily automate these processes that are going to be needed. The other thing is this information overload for buyers? Are they going to read all these 3 documents? Is there a risk that it's going to confuse buyers more than they would otherwise? And I think the other thing that springs to mind is the approach is about telling people about these potential hazards with shared ownership, about the costs of service charges and lease extensions. But is that just a way of avoiding the underlying issues, which are, the rogue players who are overcharging, who are managing flat blocks badly, and the government's own delay in bringing forward the lease extension legislation? Are we really just papering over the cracks here? And I think the other thing is, good sales teams are already going to be out there making sure that their buyers have all of this information and are well informed and do know what they're doing, have the information to make the right decision about buying a shared ownership home. That's just my thoughts on it. So let's bring JP back in and we will have a look at the Q&A.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been monitoring the question and answer page here, and we've got a few, Estelle. I'll start with one for you, if I may.
Of course.
So, do RPs have to send out key information documents on all current sales?
No. So the capital funding guide is a little bit vague on this. The key date is 15 September 2022. The requirements only apply to reservations taken after 15 September 2022. So you don't have to retrospectively send out the key information documents where you had a reservation that was before 15 September 2022, if that makes sense. Basically, for any grant funded shared ownership you're advertising now and taking reservations on now, then you should be using the new key information documents. I hope that answers that one. There's one here for you, JP, if that's okay. Do RPs have to use the key information documents on all shared ownership, or is it just on grant funded?
So technically, you have to use kids on grant funded shared ownership. It's a capital funding guide requirement, but it's ultimately going to be a policy decision for individual HAs as to whether they want to roll out kids to all shared ownerships and not just those that are grant funded. We've got various things to bear in mind. For example, if the Section 106 agreement specifies that the lease must be on Homes England's terms, then the safest approach to this would be to adopt the appropriate model lease, and therefore you might as well adopt the relevant kids. There's also you've also got to put yourself in the buyer's shoes. A buyer is not going to know whether their particular property they're interested in is grant funded or not. They might know someone who has recently bought a shared ownership property which happened to be grant funded, and they were provided with all this extra information. So why shouldn't they have that similar information to hand just because the HA hasn't used grant funded for their particular property? It'll probably make things easier in the long run as well for HAs to just take it's my opinion, sorry, to take a sort of the same approach across all of their sales. Once you've got a process in place, you might as well roll it out. There can only be benefits to doing so. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
I think consistency is going to be kind of key on this, really, isn't it? Or it is very quickly going to get even more confusing than it potentially is with all these different types of shared ownership lease out there, different funding programs. Probably easier to have the same approach on everything. One other question here. What, if any, penalties are in place if you fail to do this? Yeah, good question. It comes back to this being a grant funding requirement. So if you are doing grant funded shared ownership, it is a Homes England grant condition. So it will be a breach of your grant conditions if you fail to provide the key information documents as required by the capital funding guide. So I think from a RP perspective, it is going to be a case of keeping records, find ways to make sure that you can evidence on your Homes England audits that you have done these things as required by a capital funding guide. So I think we were saying perhaps adding something to your reservation form to note that you've provided the documents and discussed them. There's going to have to be evidence that the first kid, that was provided with your marketing materials initially. And then also keeping the document trail that you provided them to the buyer's solicitor towards the end when the sales memo is produced. So there is kind of quite a lot to keep track of there. And something else occurred to me, but it's now disappeared out of my head. But it is about kind of record keeping, really. And that's what I was going to say, where it is going to get confusing is going to be on the resales. But I think, as I say, let's hope that some more guidance comes out of Homes England about how that is going to work, because once you've got estate agents involved, it is the question of how do you control what they do and keep track of whether they have provided the documents. I think that is all the questions we've got for now. So that has been quite quick. I've obviously spoken far too quickly, so you'll get a bit of a bonus extra lunchtime in the pouring rain if you're in Norwich today. But thank you very much for joining us today on this first webinar. I say this is the first of a series, so there will be more to come. If you want to give us any ideas for what you would like to have covered in those future webinars, please do. We're going to be doing property stuff as well as housing management with our colleague Simon. But otherwise, that is all for today. We'll send out a copy of the slides at the end, and there will be a feedback form at the end as well. If you could fill that in, that would be really helpful for us. If you want to discuss the key information documents in more detail, or have got any queries, please don't hesitate to get in contact with myself or JP, and our contact details will be on the slides. But otherwise, as I say, thank you very much for joining us. Take care, and we hope to see you again on another webinar.